So now, in what ways was World War I a turning point in American Jewish history?
Or a milestone.
Or not, or a milestone.
Okay, so it's a tough question, especially if you're thinking about it from the point of view of New York Jews. There was a lot going on in 1917 in New York that I think would mark it as a turning point. First of all, New York acquired attributes which it had never had in the larger Jewish world, which is to say it became a safe place for all sorts of people who couldn't stay where they normally wanted to live. So you had Leon Trotsky coming to New York, and you had David Ben-Gurion coming to New York, and you had these leaders who couldn't stay either in Europe or in Palestine, and suddenly New York becomes the place to be. And because of that, New York moves up on the scale of important cities. And the neutrality of the United States in the first years of World War I is very important because it's not only a safe place, but you can pursue politics that way. So I think that the visibility of New York as a capital city, as you wrote about in your volume of City of Promises, really sort of solidifies at this point in time. And it is a kind of turning point because post-1917, New York remains the capital city of American Jews. So that's one way in which it's a turning point. The other way in which it's a turning point is that it gives real legitimacy to socialist politics in the city at this time. And that's not the international impact so much, I think, as the controversies that you mentioned over World War I and the fact that Morris Hillquit decides to run for mayor and attracts a lot of support running on a peace and milk campaign, right? So that leads, he doesn't win, I should say, in case you were wondering. No, he doesn't win, but there are plenty of other socialists who do win election to what was the version of the city council that existed then, the Board of Aldermen, to state representatives the year later. And so it becomes a point that is going to, I think, make New York a center of progressive politics and give Jews a real role in shaping that. So I would say that's another really important aspect of the turning point. We may not see the results of it until the late 20s and 30s with the Depression, with Al Smith, being governor of New York, with FDR moving from the governorship of New York to the presidency. But I think you can trace a lot of that to 1917.
I also think 1917 is a tremendous turning point, actually, particularly when considered from the perspective of the war and the military. And this applies to the Jewish community in the United States writ large and to New York specifically. So what do I mean by that? When the war breaks out, or rather when the U.S. enters the war, and the government decides on a policy of mass conscription, suddenly there are a lot of Jews who enter the military. And in the course of the war, the ascension of the Jewish Welfare Board as the major organization that acts as sort of the node or the interface between the military and the Jewish community is what helps establish Jews as one of what becomes eventually the three fighting faiths. And in so doing, what this does is position Jews as Americans, but it also centers a lot of institutional politics in New York. The Jewish Welfare Board, Cyrus Adler, though he's in Philadelphia and moving between D.C. and New York, he's the head of the Jewish Welfare Board, which is established in 1917, and he's bringing together a number of both religious and communal institutions to serve soldiers. And that, I think, contributes to the way in which New York becomes this capital city, that the institutional politics really gets centered in New York and becomes the place where, no matter where someone is from, a Reform rabbi who might have a pulpit in Arkansas, have been ordained in Cincinnati, is still connected connected through New York with the rest of the Jewish community. And so the lines of communication are all going through New York. If you look at just letters between communities, welfare workers, working with soldiers, the American military, they're all moving through New York addresses. So I think that's part of what solidifies New York as a capital city, and contributes to this larger shift in which Jews become an American group, an American religious group, and start to build an anchor and a foundation within American society that they didn't have before.
So already your answers bring up a lot more questions. So one of them, I think, is, and I've always kind of had trouble dealing with this question when I've been asked it. So there was a lot of opposition to the war among American Jews, especially, in New York, where it was such an Eastern European immigrant community. Of course, Russian Jews had no love for the Russian government, and so they were not anxious for the United States to enter the war on the side of Russia, which was the most likely scenario, because Russia was on the side of Britain and France. And on the other hand, Austrian Jews, Galician Jews, who were actually, Galicia was, southern Poland was part of Austria, they actually had positive feelings towards the emperor and Franz Josef of Austria, because the Austrian Empire was, Austro-Hungarian Empire was more liberal. So there was a lot of opposition to the war. But in February or March 1917, the first revolution took place in Russia, and the Tsar was overthrown. And so that takes away that issue. In April, the United States entered the war, and you have this mobilization. As you said, many Jews entered the military. Jews were recognized as a legitimate religious group. And there was this patriotic feeling too, but at the same time, later in that year, there was this socialist campaign for mayor by Morris Hillquit, a prominent socialist lawyer in New York. And as Deborah said, he didn't win, but he got 21% of the vote in a four-way race, which he only came in a couple percentage points behind the incumbent, John Proy Mitchell. So this was considered, a great upsurge in socialist support. And it was a peace and milk campaign. We have an article coming out in the journal American Jewish History, which argues that it was mainly a peace campaign. And so this was an anti-war statement. So how do we reconcile this very widespread anti-war sentiment with, at the same time, this sometimes enthusiastic participation in the war effort and in the military?
I think one thing to always keep in mind when we're talking about war and the military is that the military functions as many different organizations in one. So it is, of course, fighting a war. It is a machine of war, but it's also a social space. And that social role can be as important as the fighting role. And so for Jews, remember, since we have conscription, we have a draft, you're drafted. It was very hard in World War I to be a conscientious objector to war. So even those who wanted to resist the war, and they could dissent certainly verbally in articles and newspapers and conversations with others, but it would be very difficult because of the way the Selective Service Act of 1917 positioned conscientious objectors really as only those from pacifist or peace churches. Jews couldn't make that case, which meant that no matter what they felt about the war, they were likely to be conscripted. And once you're in, and then you're in a space often with a lot of other Jews, because of the way in which military installations at the time and units were geographically clustered. So here in New York, many Jews went to Camp Upton and Yaphank on Long Island. And that became a space of bonding unto itself and a space of creating opportunities. Some of them would ship out to Europe, not everyone would. But this space as a social space, I think, enables some of the support, not necessarily for the war itself, but for the opportunity to show themselves as a community that was American, that was patriotic, and should be seen as such.
So your question, I think, is really important, and it's worth remembering that you've got over 1 million Jews in New York at this point. And this is a lot of people. And so to say that some of them were patriotic, yeah, you can say some of them were patriotic. To say that some of them opposed the war, you can say that too. And you can come up with the statistics, like the people who voted for Hillquit, some of whom may have voted for him not necessarily because they were opposed to the war, but for other reasons having to do with the socialist cause. I think what your question, in a sense, illuminates is the diversity of views among American Jews. That diversity is going to end up, of course, suffering when the war ends, and you get the Palmer raids, and you get efforts to restrict freedom of speech, and you get some of the radicals deported, like Emma Goldman and others. So, and of course, the consolidation of the communist revolution. So it's one of those, we use this word liminal moment, right, of flux, where there's still opportunities. That article coming out, I mean, among the things that it points out, of course, is that Hillquit was a lawyer and indeed knew how to modulate his speeches so that he didn't run into trouble to get arrested for being opposed, let's say, to the draft, which would have gotten him into trouble.
So another question that arises is, because you mentioned rabbis coming from other places. So bringing us out of New York a little bit, do you have a sense of, this may not be, maybe you don't, but maybe you do, how New York Jewry differed from Jews in other parts of the country?
So one way New York Jewry differs is that there are just so many Jews in New York that this is a community that is both large and diverse internally. That there's, I think, a lot more. It's more typical for Jews from New York to have encountered other Jews who have different viewpoints, other smaller communities. Sure, there's a Jewish community, but there are good reasons, depending on where it's located, to appear less diverse, even if, of course, internally most Jewish communities, like most communities, have their internal politics and divisions. There was a need to present as united. And I think Jews from New York who entered the military were often more comfortable in some ways standing out as different. It wasn't as necessary to seem like there was a single community. But this, again, is amplified in some ways by virtue of the fact that many Jewish soldiers are serving together, so they don't have to necessarily present themselves as anything but who they are. Now, in some cases they do, and they do stand out, or at least they're a noticeable entity. So there are definitely recorded stories of non-Jewish chaplains working to figure out how do you serve Jews, and they know they need to serve Jews because there are large numbers in their units, and suddenly they have to become familiar with Judaism. And I think part of the story of understanding the impact of World War I is also understanding that when government figures are interacting with the Jewish community, they don't want to see difference, right? They want a Jewish community to work with. And so there is a need to present a united front, which is what an organization like the Jewish Welfare Board has to do, and it has to manage the internal politics so that they can exist. They can have as many debates that can take as long as they want when they're meeting here in New York. But when they write a letter or a memo or make a request to the government, they have to appear united as one. And that's the way to create leverage and to say that, of course, as a community, we need something.
So one of the things that's really unusual, I think, in the World War I situation for New York Jews who get drafted at Upton is that you have Jewish officers as well as Jewish enlisted men. And so that you've got Jews at different ranks, which certainly doesn't happen in World War II. I mean, in one big unit, yeah.
Well, yeah, could you say a little bit more about the difference of experience? Because it sounds, I always had this image, and maybe it's from World War II more, that when these young men were drafted or when they volunteered, they went into this big American kind of organization, which was like not a melting pot, but a pressure cooker, right? And part of that was that they were coming into contact with all kinds of other Americans. And we, you know, a lot of this was promoted as an image by these movies in World War II, right? The melting, the units from, with the Brooklyn Jewish guy and the guy from the South and all these kinds
the
of
mixed
things.
platoon. Yeah.
Right. So was it, is that just World War II, or is World War I completely different? What was the experience?
It's not completely different. I think this is a place where it's actually a starting point. So actually, a number of the posters for victory bonds and other sort of advertising campaigns to raise money for the war actually do like list last names the way that will become very familiar in World War II. It's often a poster of Lady Liberty, and then again, like just a list of last names that signify different ethnic groups. So they certainly are coming into contact with people from different backgrounds and other faiths. One way in which this happens, particularly for those who are in Europe, are that there are parallel organizations to the Jewish Welfare Board, the Knights of Columbus, the Red Cross, the YMCA, the Federal Council of Churches, and they all have these huts. Right? These are these recreation and entertainment facilities that they are using to try and create wholesome activities for the young men who they are very concerned about their both morals and morale. But then, right, if there's a card game going on, a musical event or other things, that these are intended to bring a lot of people into that same space and to actually socialize together, right? They're not just fighting together, but socializing together. And that's one way in which that interaction occurs. So there is both the experience of being with other Jews, but also encounter with others. And in the case of New York Jews encountering, I think, rural Americans, it can often be quite a distance to bridge, but it's part of what the war experience does enable, is that encounter and discovery that one can, in fact, be friends across these lines. You can also fight internally across these lines. It's not a perfect relationship by any means, but it certainly creates an opportunity that didn't exist before the war.
So, can you say a little bit about how World War I marks a turning point for chaplains and Jews? Because I think that's, when you say that it's sort of foundational, it's really crucial. Obviously, there were Jewish chaplains in the Civil War, and I think even the Spanish-American War, right? But World War I is different.
Right. So when the U.S. enters the war in April 1917. First of all, the Chaplain Corps is a pretty middling organization. The Navy has about 45 chaplains. The Army has a couple hundred. This is completely insufficient to the 2 million young men that are going to be drafted into the military. So the Chaplain Corps as a whole is on an expansion campaign. The Navy Chaplain Corps quintuples, and the Army Chaplain Corps reaches over 2,200 chaplains in the course of the war, so that's about a tenfold increase. But again, there are no Jewish chaplains in the military when World War I starts, and that's in part because the Jewish chaplains that had served previously were kind of serving on an ad hoc or informal basis. And one of the debates that then arises is whether the War Department and the Bureau of Navigation can simply appoint Jewish chaplains, or whether chaplains have to be authorized by Congress. And there are a lot of discussions. Cyrus Adler from the Jewish Welfare Board is petitioning the War Department, but he's also working with Representative Isaac Siegel, who's a New York Republican. And what Siegel does is really work Congress to accomplish this goal. So there is what becomes known as a Chaplains at Large bill, which is passed on October 26, 1917, or that's when it's actually signed into law, so about 100 years ago this month. And that authorizes what these chaplains at large from the Jewish community, but also Mormons, Christian Scientists, the Salvation Army, and the Eastern Orthodox. And this really is the moment that the chaplaincy formally opens to religions outside of mainline Protestantism and Catholicism. And it's this process that then creates these spaces, designated spaces for Jewish chaplains. And General John Pershing, who is running the American Expeditionary Force in France, is very supportive of this. He actually pretty immediately requests 25 Jewish chaplains to send to France. He doesn't actually get 25. but he is supportive. And this then has a cascade effect, because once Jewish chaplains are entering the space, it raises all these questions. Who's going to endorse chaplains? So to become a chaplain, a rabbi in this case has to be a rabbi, but also has to have what's called an ecclesiastical endorsement, so that the government isn't deciding if this person's a good rabbi or not. The religious community is. This raises the question of who's going to play this role. Are the seminaries? But again, the government doesn't want to deal with more than one Jewish group. So the JWB takes this on over Representative Siegel's protests, well, really hubris that he would be the best person to just make these decisions. I just leave it up to him, and he would pick very good chaplains. You never know, maybe he would have. But what the JWB does, and I think this is actually very smart, is they create a committee on chaplains, and that committee has representatives from the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox movements, so they're forced to collaborate in this space in a way that they're not forced to in civilian life. So this is just one of the ways then, so Jews, once they enter the chaplaincy, who's making these decisions? And another way this comes up is the question of insignia. So everyone in the military, officers, display who they are. And in 1917, the insignia for chaplains was a cross. It's a little bit of a problem. Both the Jewish chaplains are frustrated by this, and they note that, right, they kind of are on the lookout for Jewish soldiers, and Jewish soldiers look at them quizzically, like, you say you're a Jewish chaplain, but you've got a cross on your collar. That's weird. So what are we going to do about this? The military is semi-open to a change, but they're not particularly interested in figuring out the details. The Jewish community suggests, not surprisingly, a Star of David, but the military immediately rejects that as too close to a general's star. Definitely wouldn't want the new Jewish chaplain mistaken for a general.
You could have 5 of them.
Right. Like, this is a matter of intense concern. So it is a different committee. Military loves committees. These civilian groups love committees. The Committee of Six, which is a group of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews that start to work on this, because one suggestion from the military had been to go back to the 19th century insignia of a shepherd's crook, which is a little less Christian, but still Christian. But it was actually American Christians who really bristled at that. They wanted to maintain the cross. So what was going to happen? So eventually, this committee suggests tablets that have a Star of David on top, and the military does accept that as an option. But that's one of the ways that once Jews enter the military has to start figuring out, when do we designate Jewish chaplains as Jewish? When are they just chaplains? Because their task, like every chaplain, is to serve everyone. They can't just serve Jews. They have to serve everyone in their units. But at times, it really does matter that they're Jewish, and one of the ways is how they designate themselves.
So these chaplains, they were mobilized. They were in the army. But who did they really work for? In their own minds, who were they really working for? Were they working for the army? Were they working for the Jewish community? Were they working for the Jewish Welfare Board?
A little bit of each. I think primarily they're working for Jewish soldiers, and in that sense, the Jewish community, but also for the military. One of the things that comes up, and I was actually very skeptical of this when I first started reading material from the archives, that they all talk about what an amazing experience it is to be in this interfaith space, working both with other non-Jewish chaplains and with non-Jewish soldiers. And at first this seemed like, I don't know, maybe this is just them creating this nice gloss on this experience. But it came up enough to start to seem like this has some legs. And it also came up from non-Jewish chaplains talking about what an incredible experience it was to work with Jewish chaplains and with Jewish soldiers. So I also think for many of them, what became meaningful was working within this interfaith space. And in that sense, they were serving the United States, not even necessarily the military, but it was a way of serving their country through religion.
And one more question about this, which is, how did this then influence American Judaism or New York Judaism, American Judaism, in terms of the denominations and the relations between the denominations?
Well, this, as I mentioned, sets up this space in which Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Jews have to work together. And during World War I, the Jewish chaplains were either Reform or Conservative. There was concern from the Orthodox Jewish community about this, but this was actually a decision that, while sometimes framed by Orthodox Jews as a form of discrimination, was a result of the military's education requirements for chaplains. So chaplains have to have bachelor's degrees from accredited universities, as well as graduate training or ordination. And in 1917, no Orthodox rabbis could fulfill that requirement. But the rabbis who did serve as chaplains still had to serve Orthodox Jews and others in the service. So part of what the war sets up then is this type of cooperation and trying to weave a way for these communities to work together in ways, again, that they never would in civilian life. And so there absolutely is frustration and tension and dissent about what this looks like, who, again, is a good rabbi. To what degree should American Jews lobby for kosher food in the military? They try. It's not a very successful effort. But there's interesting behind-the-scenes work. Like, they get Hebrew National to agree to sell meat at a loss to the military if the military is willing to buy it. The military is not actually willing to set up separate kosher mess halls.
Because it wasn't glot, I think. That was the problem.
And actually, the JW makes a really interesting argument to the military that they should see this not as necessarily just helping American Jews, but part of making the military equivalent to militaries worldwide, like the French, the British, who in their imperial endeavors had provided halal or vegetarian food for Muslim and Hindu soldiers abroad, that even the German and Austrian armies, it claimed, had handled kosher food better. The military is not swayed by these arguments. They're content to let the JWB send kosher, whether it's canned food or other items. But that's one way in which there has to be this negotiation. Some Jews really care, obviously, about kosher food. Some don't care at all. But what's the JWB's line going to be? What are chaplains going to advocate for? Is an active and live question. But in general, what this is setting up is this need to cooperate, to think about what prayers, even in a Friday night or Saturday morning service, what prayers are said, how long that service is going to be, might be dictated by a commanding officer who says you only have an hour, so deal, but what's that going to look like? These are questions that will be perennial questions over the rest of the 20th century, but it's World War I that sets up the structure for this negotiation.
So we talked about the Hillquit campaign, socialism, and you mentioned David Ben-Gurion, and you mentioned the Star of David. What about Zionism? So how was the Balfour Declaration received by American Jews? How did 1917? What was the state of American Zionism in 1917?
Okay, so the Balfour Declaration, I don't think, made a huge impact. The state of American Zionism had been affected more by the location of the governing Zionist bodies in New York City, hence Ben-Gurion coming there, but also by Louis Brandeis and his campaigns on behalf of Zionism. Brandeis had drawn closer to the Jewish community, in part in New York, because he had helped to mediate one of the large strikes that took place in 1910, the cloakmakers' strike. And there's that moment until he's nominated to the Supreme Court by Wilson, where he is a very active Zionist and busy attracting much larger numbers to the Zionist fold. There's also an effort made by Zionists at this time to create an American Jewish Congress that they hope will come up with a a program for the post-war world. And the program for the post-war world is surely going to include Zionism as part of it. And the Congress itself is a really interesting phenomenon. This is not the American Jewish Congress that gets established later. This is a one-time Congress where people actually vote for representatives. And it puts off its first meeting until after the war and takes on a vision of Jews as connected, as a people, connected across national boundaries. And it seems to me that that's one of the biggest things that Zionism brings to American Jews. Less the focus specifically on Palestine and the mobilization to create a potential state or homeland there, and more this sense of a profound commitment to Jews throughout the world, but in a political sense and not just in a philanthropic sense. Because you had the organization of, once the war begins, of the Joint Distribution Committee, right? So that is the philanthropic organizing of American Jews, and it's located also in New York and becomes a very important organization, and it is connected to the Joint that's still around today, which is, I guess it celebrated its 100th anniversary a couple of years ago, yeah. But Zionism does have this political dimension, and a socialist like Meyer London, in Congress, doesn't vote in favor of, there's a resolution passed in Congress in favor of the Balfour Declaration, and he opposes it. So that you see the Balfour Declaration perhaps also articulating the disagreements between socialists on the one hand and Zionists on the other, even though you have the Zionist socialists who partake of both of them. But the socialists at the last minute boycott, for example, the elections to the American Jewish Congress. And so they have very few representatives there. So it's really hard to say how much the Balfour Declaration per se does. I mean, I think it's a kind of mobilizing element, but it's also divisive among American Jews.
How about different visions of Zionism? I'm thinking of, Brandeis. We think of him as a leader who was trying to Americanize Zionism, to show that Zionism was really American. If you want to be a good American, you should be a Zionist, and vice versa. Versus someone like Ben-Gurion, who was recently arrived, who had a very different sense of, Jewish centrist kind of and Palestine-centric kind of politics.
So I would say actually that probably the most important Zionists who become active during World War I is the group of Zionists around Henrietta Zold, who create Hadassah. And that becomes this real Zionist vision. It's also a feminist vision. They send, both nurses and physicians there as soon as the fighting ends. But they start to mobilize women. And it's one of those, as it were, turning points, because as a result of 1917 and 1918, the end of the war, Hadassah goes on to build a very influential kind of American Zionist organization that does not fall prey to the infighting between the David Ben-Gurions and the Chaim Weizmann and others, Brandeis when he steps back from it after the war.
Of course, that's also a philanthropic vision, right? It's kind of combines this Zionism with the kind of American philanthropy.
Yeah, but one of the things I think is really important is that Hadassah does bring American and I would say American Jewish values to Palestine. When they set up their clinics, they serve everybody, irrespective of, we would say, race, religion, and national origin. But they serve Christians, they serve Muslims, they serve Jews, they serve Arabs and Jews. There's that progressive ethos that's crucial to it. So yeah, it's philanthropic, but it also has an American perspective there.
We have time for questions from the crowd. So, are there any questions? Yes.
Well, yeah, a lot of what we've been talking about does have to do with New York because these activities were taking place there, right? Henrietta Zold organizes initially Hadassah in the vestry rooms of Temple Emmanuel, and she goes on to build a very an organization that becomes much larger than New York. So looking at 1917, which is an international time period, you're looking at what's happening in the city in relationship to the larger world as well.
And the other thing I'll just quickly add is that keeping in mind that New York was a major port of embarkation meant that a lot of people who weren't New York Jews initially end up becoming New York Jews when they come back through New York and settle in New York. So it's another kind of outgrowth or ramification of the war on New York itself.
Yeah, I would say also that since New York is everything, when you talk about everything, you're talking about New York. Yes, Rabbi Marker.
Okay, so the question, I will repeat the question, yes. So the question is very good, and I had the election of 1917 and the women winning the vote, which they had not won 2 years earlier in 1915. So that too is a part of the turning point here in New York's history, and women get the right to vote in New York before they get the right to vote nationally. That was one piece of the question. It is only to be affirmed. The other piece of the question was, what was the impact of the war on the New York Kahillah? So the New York Kahillah was an organization that began in response to allegations by the police commissioner in 1908 that Jews were a disproportionate number of criminals in the city, right? That there were a lot of Jews in the city, but there were far more criminals in the city than the proportion of Jews would make one think. And not only that, he had nasty things to say about the type of crime that they did, that they tended to do pickpocketing, and they weren't bold enough to do more horrible crimes and whatever. It got many Jews really upset, and it became a motivating force to try to bring together what was called Uptown, which is to say acculturated, more prosperous middle and upper middle class Jews together with, also wealthy Jews, together with downtown, or the immigrant community, which was a working class community but also had elements of the middle class there. So the Kahillah is formed in 1909, and it sets out efforts to deal with Jewish differences. It tries to supervise kashrut. It tries to improve Jewish education. It tries to study American Jews, and it produces this wonderful document, which is, 1,500, 1,700 pages. It's a huge document which lists everything that's in New York that's Jewish at the time, or at least they try to. They try to have all the organizations. They send out these young men, to take a census of Jews, and also to notice signs and that kind of stuff. So the Kahillah is doing a lot of things, and it's fighting crime, right? Which is how it began. But the head of the Kahillah is Judah Magnus, who's the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel. Magnus comes from Oakland, California, via Hebrew Union College. He's one of your outside rabbis, to New York. And Magnus is a pacifist. And he's a pacifist when World War I begins in 1914. And he's a pacifist in 1917 when the United States enters the war. And he will not forego his pacifism. It is a belief that he holds that he doesn't see as personal. It's not about conscientious objection. He sees it as integral to what it means to be Jewish. And he interprets the anti-war sentiment among immigrants as an expression of their authentic Jewish pacifism. it makes him unable to serve as the bridge between uptown and downtown, because there are too many people in both of those places who have become patriotic, who are not pacifists, and essentially it accelerates the Cahilla's decline. There had been other fissures before. The socialists especially really didn't go for Magnus. Magnus is ineffective anymore as a leader, and that leads to the demise of the Kahilla. And then he goes to Palestine.
I just want to point out that Magnus, Rabbi Stephen Wise, was also a pacifist, always between the wars, and he always supported the war effort when it came around. Magnus was more consistent, but I think the point is that the Kahilla was always kind of a fragile organization, that there were so many factions within the community that didn't see why they should cooperate, and so this was kind of the last straw that that Magnus became kind of someone that people wanted to stay away from. And I also wanted to add about the suffrage referendum. So this was a referendum, a statewide referendum in New York, and it was being run at the same time as the Hillquit campaign. So the Hillquit campaign raised a lot of excitement and brought a lot of people out to vote, most of whom almost certainly voted in favor of suffrage. These were all men, after all, because they were the ones who could vote. And pretty much Jews across the board supported suffrage. The radicals supported suffrage. The uptowners supported suffrage. The rabbis supported suffrage. It's also true that Tammany Hall supported suffrage by that time, but their core constituency, which was mostly Irish Catholic, was the weakest link in the pro-suffrage chain. The Jewish communities were very pro-suffrage. Yes.
Right, so this was a question about the numbers or percentages of immigrant soldiers or first-generation soldiers, as well as the status of chaplains. So to the second question, right, chaplains enter the military as first lieutenants, so they immediately have officer status, which is important, and it's one of the way, and this is true not just of Jews, but for a number of communities, and this is in fact probably even more pronounced in the African American community, that the chaplaincy became a vehicle of officer status, particularly maintained through the interwar period before, again, mass mobilization in World War II. I don't have a precise estimate on the number of immigrant soldiers, but it's absolutely the case that many, many, many were immigrant soldiers. One of the features of the military at this time was also then teaching English and kind of general literacy, which is work that chaplains and others did. So in that sense, the military provided not simply immediate citizenship, but a form of kind of fast assimilation, certainly linguistically and otherwise. And it was one of the reasons that the military was so concerned with, again, you have a huge number of immigrants, not Jews, but also from other religions and ethnicities. How do you get them to work together, to fight together, when they may not even speak English? So that was a part of the core mission in many ways. As I said earlier, militaries can serve in multiple functions. So it was fighting the war, but it was also Americanizing these immigrant soldiers.
Was it a fast track to citizenship? Yes.
Yes. Sure. Well, this is a question about the image on the cover. So this is an image from the South Pacific in World War II. It is the first Sunday service after the landing on Guam. It's actually, you're not the first person to say this, but it's actually a Catholic chaplain presiding over this service. What I don't know is much about the soldiers in it, but it was the first service held on Guam in World War II.
We should clarify that your book is not just about 1917 or World War I, or not just about Jews, right?
Oh, right. Your book covers much of the 20th century. And obviously, Jewish New York starts in 1654 and goes all the way up to 2015.
So I think the question concerns the role of Jewish philanthropy in socializing young Jews, in improving and maintaining living conditions, and how World War I and 1917 influenced the direction of Jewish philanthropy. The question is whether it was also a parallel form of socialism.
So I think it's tricky to say whether it's a form of socialism per se, because I think there are multiple forces behind the philanthropic gesture, and the Joint Distribution Committee itself is a really good example of that, because the Joint Distribution Committee drew money from very wealthy people who were not giving it out of any kind of socialist commitment, but were giving it, you know, in a sense because it was a more charitable kind of notion. They also drew money from the religious people who were giving it because it was a religious commandment to give money. So that was a separate organization. But then the third organization was indeed a socialist one. It was drawn from the labor community, and there were Jews who gave because of a shared understanding about socialism requiring to give to people according to their needs. And they stepped up to do that. So the Joint, in a sense, acquired money from three very different sources in its philanthropy and proceeded to distribute it in Europe in different ways as well. I think that, you know, in these years, there's certainly, when social work itself is a very new field, there are people who go into social work, both men and women, who have visions of a more equal society and are going to try to do that, whether it's in terms of healthcare or whether it's in terms of, you know, better recreational facilities for kids. But that what animates them is a desire to try to mitigate the excesses of capitalism and the ways in which capitalism constantly produces inequality. So that does exist, but it doesn't characterize all philanthropy by any means.
The other thing is, and I think 1917 and this moment is a good, this may be more of a milestone than a turning point, but the notion of public-private partnerships is really important. I mean, it's exemplified in World War I with the U.S. Food Administration and the way it's working both through government subsidies, government policies, as well as farmers, agribusiness, and manufacturing to maintain and build the food supply is a way in which it is addressing multiple issues, but one of which is, of course, hunger. But it is using a variety of sources of money to do so. And actually, one, just as a side note to that, in terms of food policy in World War I, one major advance is actually the development in food science of Crisco, and as a replacement for lard, which actually you get. There's amazing World War I era posters from the U.S. Food Administration really trying to sell the American public on Crisco as the oil they should be using, and particularly around the making donuts. And for Jews, this is actually really important in terms of being able to be participants in American food culture, because they're no longer separate or separating over the use of lard or pork products. Obviously, in other realms, they still are, but it's one of those small details that, for some, makes a big difference.
So the question is, how did the sizable German Jewish community in New York that was well established and integrated into the city, and many of them leaders of the city, feel about American entry into World War I on the side of the Allies and not on the side of Germany and Austria? You raised the possibility that there was ambivalence. I think, yes, there definitely was ambivalence about this, that they were not happy. I mean, World War I, we should emphasize, is the war when Jews are fighting other Jews, right? It is not World War II. And there are patriotic Jews in all of these European countries who are fighting each other. And so what it leads German Jews in New York to do is to downplay their Germanness, to not speak in public, to use German on the streets, but to retreat to the privacy of their homes. It doesn't lead them to become outspokenly opposed to the war on the grounds that Germany is the country the U.S. should have sided with. But it does diminish their public Germanness, and I think in the long run ends up diminishing the private Germanness as well. The change of surnames is something that occurs after World War I in the 20s and 30s, and it's mostly a response to anti-Semitism, because how do you recognize a Jew in the 20s and 30s? By a distinctive Jewish name. And that's when the numbers of name changes in New York City increase enormously. Yes.
So I have one final question, is maybe you can say something about the effects, whether there are effects of World War I that we still feel today.
Okay, so the United States decided after World War I to pass anti-immigrant legislation. And I think that the patriotism that was whipped up during the war against hyphenated Americans, as they were called then, whether you're talking about Jewish Americans or Italian Americans or German Americans, whatever the hyphen referring to what was between those two words, has the result of producing the most drastic anti-immigration legislation. You previously had anti-immigration legislation against Chinese. You had Asian Exclusion Act against people coming from Asia. But now you had an Immigration Act that was for all of the world, with the exception of the Western Hemisphere, and reducing the numbers of people who come very, very, to very small numbers. And I think that when we look around today and we hear people rail against immigrants, that much of the rhetoric sounds like it's coming out of post-World War I. The same kind of rhetoric. So, yeah, we're still living with anti-immigrant rhetoric.
I think one of the lasting consequences of World War I in terms of American religion is understanding that American religion encompassed more than Christianity, more than Protestantism. It's the moment in which Catholics and Jews really become part of this orbit. I'm not making the claim that obviously anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism and nativism follows World War I, but in that moment, the government recognition of these groups, and then ultimately the proliferation of other groups that the government will recognize does shift what counts. And this will zig and zag in terms of inclusion on the ground, socially and civic culture, but in the sense that there is recognition of a multi-faith space by the government. Again, there had been multiple religious groups prior to World War I, and it will not always be smooth sailing after World War I, but the idea that you cannot think American religion is a single thing, namely Protestant Christianity, I think is a significant artifact of World War I.
So with that, we'll end, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you to our panelists.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.